Okay, all good? I now introduce our guest speaker, Geof Edge.
Good morning. My name is Geof Edge, and the reason I'm here instead of my brother Bill is unfortunately he had his own mini-war with a ladder and is now out of action for a bit. Luckily he had already done the heavy lifting and written copious notes for me to make a start. Also his wife Christine, who is on the piano here today, has her own very rich history from World War I and II. But Christine, for me, added a comment that forged the direction I have taken. A day such as this is like a jigsaw puzzle, with each contributing piece vital to the final picture. Therefore, firstly, I would like to acknowledge each and every one of you here who have come to honour the memories and many sacrifices of those, both men and women, who throughout the history of this tiny nation have strived that we may come together in peace and celebration. And to us up here in the high seats, someone has to put the puzzle together, and that is you, Jock, and your team, and the amazing amount of work you do through the district on a continual basis. Also to our brief visit from the Army, Roddy, and Padre, I would look as the corner pieces of this puzzle, and to Steve and the immense work that you do in the local community on a continual basis. As to Steve, Jock and our connection, as cousins we grew up together, their father and our mother, brother and sister. The farm where Steve now lives, we Edges grew up on, and is just a mile from the original Belsky settlers. At last year's service, Steve talked of his family connections who served. Consequently, many were ours as well. The reality of that time is there were perhaps no families who were not connected and touched personally by the tragedy of war. While this address started out as a story of one soldier, William, or as he was known, Bill Edge, more significantly, this has become your story, as each of you will have your own histories and memories from this tumultuous period in human and New Zealand history. And this story has also taken me further to that of the war and what that war did to the man. And the men, women and children where these wars took place. Bill was born in 1915 and named in memory of his uncle William Luoni, who had been killed at Gallipoli just months earlier. Then, with the horrors of World War I still fresh in memories, a new generation would soon be sailing off to another European conflict. On leaving school, Bill worked alongside his father doing various jobs: bushwork, harvesting, roadworks, fencing and shearing. He also enjoyed running, competing in road and cross-country races, local and at New Zealand championships. When turning 21, alongside many others, he joined the Territorial Army. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, he joined the Regular Army and became part of the newly forming 27th Machine Gun Battalion. The regimental badge consisting of 2 Vickers machine guns in cross formations. On the 5th of January 1940, Bill, as part of the first echelon of the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, left these shores aboard the Sobieski before finally arriving near Suez on the 15th of February. From there to further training in heat and sand before taking on the Italians through the deserts of North Africa with some setbacks, though generally modest success. Though success was not expected when early in 1941, the New Zealand Division, along with Australian and British forces, were posted to Greece in support of the Greek army, where the warmth of the Greek people was in sharp contrast to the deep snow they waded through, with only a ground sheet and blanket to keep the elements at bay at night as they faced the might of the German juggernaut. With the Allies on the back foot, they fought a rearguard action back down to the south coast of the mainland, where most of the troops, with only what equipment each could carry, were evacuated to the island of Crete. There they faced a horrendous campaign, before again being evacuated back to North Africa to face the might of Rommel's panzers. After being away from New Zealand for 4 years, Bill came home on furlough, met and married Desi Belsky, and unlike when he first joined and went off to war as a volunteer, this time he was sent back. And why did he volunteer? There will be as many reasons as there were soldiers. Officialdom may say for king and country. For him, like many others, it was a sense of adventure, a chance to travel and see the world, again many thinking the war would be over before they even got there. And with Bill now on his way back to the front, Desi was faced, along with the stress of 2 brothers who were also serving, the added fear of her new husband being killed or wounded. The war in Europe did finally end, and Bill returned to New Zealand and soon took up a rehab loan and started farming in his own right, with Desi at his side as a strong partner. Along with family life and children, Bill was also involved in activities as part of the Rangiwahia community, schooling, sports clubs, dances, etc. However, there was one activity he stayed away from: Anzac Day services. Bill went into camp in 1939. He finally returned home for good at the end of the European hostilities and was officially discharged from the army in June 1945. Of the major battles he took part in, where the main force of the New Zealand Army was deployed, the lot. Bar one, when he came home on leave for those few short months. And these first 6 medals, and bar on his service medals, issued by the New Zealand government. This little smaller one at the end I will come to soon. And Bill finally did start attending Anzac Day services, in part through gentle coaching from a very special group of fellow Crete veterans here in Apiti. And as a quick aside, I would have liked to have acknowledged each by name. Unfortunately, I know of only some, so reluctantly have chosen not to name any. However, if their descendants are here today, I would love to be able to fill in those gaps, as this day became a very special day for Bill, until the old soldier could march no more. And Desi, after the initial shock, 2 years later returned to the special day, now with another Bill at her side, this time her son. They were soon joined by other family members and then grandchildren. And I see some great-grandchildren here this morning, so that's wonderful. For me, growing up locally in an area that had not been touched by the earlier internal wars within New Zealand, wars to me were always somewhere out there, somewhere else. The Boer War in Africa, then later World War I and II in Europe and Japan. So it was until my first trip to England. I was living and working in an area where these wars actually took place. I saw the evidence, and talked firsthand with those who had lived through it and how it had affected them and their local communities, just like this one here in Apiti and the surrounding areas. Then in latter years I was staying with a friend in France, and in the evenings we would go down to the local bar and talk of life and times. We did have the odd beer or two, of course. However, on the wall behind where we sat was a plaque showing the place a local resistance fighter was shot by the Gestapo during the German occupation in World War II. And when we went through the museum featuring the infamous exploits of Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Leon, and saw film footage of first-hand testimony of the atrocities he had inflicted on local men, and especially the women, I walked out of the museum stunned. I was speechless. On a brighter note, my friend and I flew to the island of Crete so I could retrace the steps Bill had taken 76 years earlier. Which brings me to this little medal here at the end. It was granted by the Greek government in recognition for service to Greece and the island of Crete. As to the comment Christine made that gave me the direction I would take with this presentation, she had mentioned the trip her and her brother, my brother Bill, had taken to Crete just a few years earlier than I. And as the bus they were travelling in zigged and zagged down a very steep and barren incline from a high plateau and finally reaching a tiny and isolated village on the south coast, there on the edge of the sparkling waters of the Mediterranean is a small monument. And gently floating in the breeze is the New Zealand flag. This is where the surviving troops were finally evacuated after the Battle of Crete. The Battle of Crete. When the armed forces were evacuated from Greece to Crete, their supplies were limited to what each man could carry, many even leaving their weapons behind as ordered. There was a limited resupply on the island, though they were still scraping the barrel in preparation for the triumphant juggernaut now flexed its muscles across on the mainland. In what was to be the largest airborne attack operation ever undertaken. The prime targets, the port at Suda Bay, and the airfields at Heraklion and Milan. On the morning of May 20th, 1941, all hell broke loose. On Milan airfield, German troops were pouring out of gliders and parachutes were floating into a hailstorm of machine gun and rifle fire. The noise, the smoke, the heat, the grime, the sweat and dust, the confusion of battle. The firestorm was relentless. However, the might of the German army was greater, and by midnight the Allies were forced to withdraw. The fighting continued in valleys, villages, and the surrounding hills, with counter and counter-attack and hand-to-hand combat. After days of heavy fighting, the order was made to evacuate Crete. The retreating troops now faced a 60-kilometre march up through a harsh, dry and barren terrain, with a lack of food and water as more headwinds, as they trudged wearily to a sparsely populated plateau some 3,500 feet above sea level. Then navigating a perilous descent through high cliff faces and steep ravines, in darkness to avoid the carnage being poured upon them by the German Air Force before they could reach that rocky beach on the south coast. At midnight on the 28th of May, the evacuation began. Over the next 4 nights, around 17,000 Allied servicemen were taken off the island. Around 12,000 were left behind to meet their fate. Many local Crete civilians were rounded up and executed by the Germans for helping our soldiers. After the troops arrived back in Egypt, they were retrained and equipped to continue the war against Rommel's forces. And so to the legacy for the peoples of New Zealand and those of Crete as we sit here today. As like I said at the start, this is also your story, for now there is an immortal bond between these two tiny island nations that will never be broken, and best symbolised by that New Zealand flag flying on the south coast of the island. Bill went to war as a soldier, but what had the war done to Bill as a man? The Vickers machine gun was a lethal weapon and required 3 men to operate. And here again, I'm not completely sure of all 3 names, so I've adopted the same polish as before. The weapon took 1 man working the cooling system to keep it from overheating. The belt man to feed in the ammunition, and the soldier on the trigger was my father. And even too near the end of his life, my mother would wake him from his screaming nightmares and would ask what was wrong. There was deathly silence. And as I sat beside him watching historic footage on TV of the German onslaught onto the airfield at Malem, I quietly asked, what was it like? This old man, still strong in heart and mind, just hunched over and started crying. There is much to ponder. On this day in 2017, under a hot Cretan sun in that high mountain pass, my father with the other soldiers struggled wearily across in May 1941. As I emerged from a deep gorge on returning from a much shorter walk, I sweat and strain as I step over hard rocky ground in this harsh and barren landscape of an imposing white mountain and towering cliffs. I wonder of the intense heat in the day and withering cold at night these men endured, the deep gorges and ravines they navigated, the tiny gorse-like bushes that pricked the finger on touch, the olive trees growing wild they hid behind and sometimes picked the unripened olives and ate anything just to survive. And the lack of water in this hot and hostile environment. How did these men, weary, hungry and with parched lips, deal with the Luftwaffe raining revenge down upon them as they walked on the road our hire car zigged and zagged in the lower gears on its long way to reach that high plateau in this isolated mountain pass? How did these men cope with having to leave some of their fellow soldiers behind because for them there was no longer any hope? I see the steep drop back down to the Mediterranean and the perilous walk and evacuation of some that could only be done in darkness. And how can I tell of the many soldiers who sacrificed their own lives and freedoms that others would make it to safety? And when I looked over Milan airfield and visited a cemetery of the German dead, how can I comprehend the pain and loss expressed by their family members, as I wondered, was it at my father's hand? Or how can I relate the stories of locals rising in the fight and joining those defending their homeland from invasion by a foreign country with an advanced armoury and helping with whatever they could hold, be it shotgun, spade or axe, or the reprisals they faced when the conquering army gained control? How can I explain on our arrival in this foreign country the guiding hand that led us as we bumbled half-blind to places we needed to see and people we needed to meet? And as we booked in at that small hotel, could I have foreseen the young hostess when told the purpose of our stay? She tells us her father was in the army in more recent times, and his grandfather was from a little village and had told her many stories of the war. How can I describe the instant bond when we meet and the stories we share? Or the bottle of wine he gave me from the grape that he had grown? Or the bowl of fruit and plate of home baking that was in our room when we returned each day? How can I relate the feeling when I bought a painting of the area and got in conversation? The old shopkeeper, on recognising my accent, showed me a photo of his father and a New Zealander who had fought together at Milan. I said my father was also there. Suddenly my purchase did not cost as much. How can I hold in words the feeling when I meet the man who looks after the museum we stumbled upon in that high mountain pass, whose father, as a 10-year-old boy, had witnessed the retreat and later set up the museum? The only words I spoke, I am from New Zealand and my father was here. I am from New Zealand and my father was here in the war. As the instant pull of a magnet, two men snap fast in a powerful embrace that spans the gap between language, lifetimes and distant lands, and neither wants to let go. When they finally do and look deeply into each other's eyes, there are no words, only tears. Thank you.
Thank you, Geoff. We'll try another hymn, shall we? After that magnificent presentation from Geof Edge. I think you give him a clap, eh? That was awesome.